Great. Well, the reading today can be found on page 1011, James chapter 1, and I'm going to read verses 1 to 8. So James chapter 1, verses 1 to 8, and that's on page 1011. Warm welcome to those online as well, in case you're tuning in. Starting at verse 1. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes of the dispersion, greetings. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Over to Chris.
Very sorry about that. Every now and then, batteries run out. Or I didn't turn it on properly, something like that. Anyway, very warm welcome to our lunchtime talk. We're in a new series. We're in the book of James. I've been looking forward to getting into this again for some time. So thank you for joining us this lunchtime. You'll see where we're going on the handout, and you've heard the passage read, James 1, 1 to 8. Now, the key question that I believe this section of James is answering, I've put at the top of your handout there, you'll see it. How can I be not just content, but actually joyful when setbacks happen to me? How can I be not just content, but actually joyful? Now, I realize that that's quite a big proposition, hard to get our heads around, and that will be massively different for every one of us. It depends on your character, it depends on what's going on in your life, and you may well add, well, it depends on what you mean, or what James means, more precisely, by being joyful. It depends what we mean by a trial or a setback. And as you start to sort of define these sort of things, your mind may start whirling a little bit. Depends on what day of the week it is. It depends how close I am to my next holiday, when my last coffee was. It depends on your work situation, how your last appraisal went, all of the things that are still flying through your head from this morning and the stuff you've got to do this afternoon. It depends on your financial situation. It's very hard to be content financially. It's one of the things that keeps many people in the city. It depends on your reputation, you might think. It depends on your relationship status and the level of contentment that is or isn't giving you. Your family situation, perhaps. It's sometimes said, isn't it, that you're only ever as happy as your least happy child if you have children. All of these things will inevitably drive our level of contentment, or as James challenges us, to have joy. How am I meant to have joy when I've got all these things flying around in my head? And then, of course, things can become a little bit more personal as well. And you might think, well, you know, there are health issues, and there are all those things that I really hope the preacher doesn't even begin to suggest, those things that you sort of keep in the deep recesses of your mind. Well, the challenge that I believe this opening section of James is giving us is not to try and look on the bright side. It's not to try and find a silver lining, but actually to be joy-filled. That's what verse 2 is saying, to be joy-filled as the trial hits. Let me give a definition of joy. A definition of joy. Joy here in James means a deep sense of well-being that originates in the heart of a Christian, because we as Christians know that whatever happens, whether the trial is a sort of 0.1 on our scale to as serious it gets, 100, let's call it, wherever, we know whatever happens, in the end, that all is well, even during that trial, in terms of our relationship with the Lord. I remember a conversation with my great uncle some years ago now. My great uncle has long since died. He and his wife, Audrey, they worked in Iran in the 70s and 80s as missionary doctors. They were sort of family heroes, certainly of mine. They finally retired to London. They went to live in Hackney in the 90s. That was when I first arrived, when I was working in the city. Remarkable in so many ways. I mean, I could fill many an hour with stories of things that they told me, things that they got up to, both as missionaries and as doctors. They certainly achieved a lot. They ended up getting put in prison at one point for being Christians, and they didn't even know the well-being of the other person for 6 months. You know, they had some incredible stories. All of this sort of happened. They came back, they retired, they became increasingly frail, and Auntie Audrey died first. Not long after the funeral, I went round to see my uncle, and I just said to him, it was a rather sort of sobering time, and I just said to him, "How will you cope?" And he looked at me, he smiled, and he just sort of laughed a little. And he said very simply, "The Lord has always looked after me. I've got nothing to worry about." And I think that's the sort of thing that's going on here. Count it all joy. At the point of grief and frailty and trial, to know that all is well with the Lord, to count it all joy. Not to, we were having this conversation at Fleet Street Talks yesterday with some, not to sort of somehow, because I've stored up lots of sort of good will and happy memories that I can then draw on them at times of trial. Not that. At the point of trial, to say, even through the tears, I know all is well. I can be content. I can actually credit this as joy now, despite my experience. Another situation, perhaps a little bit more gritty. It's some years ago again. I was speaking with some Christian parents. Their child was diagnosed with cancer. There followed a long period of uncertainty as the little one underwent operations, followed by months and months of specialist treatment before the whole situation stabilized. And as it was stabilizing, and the child did go on to make a full recovery, but it really did not look like that at the time. As it was stabilizing, I had a quite in-depth chat with them both, and I said to them, "It must have been horrendous." And both parents were very quick to correct me. "Not at all," they replied with a smile, "not at all." And so I wanted to qualify that statement for them, and I said, okay, well, I can understand that, now as the situation stabilizing, you can sort of look back and see the Lord's hand, but at the time, it must have been horrendous. At the time, when it didn't look like there was going to be a path through. And the mum shook her head immediately and added this, and I wrote it down because it had a profound effect on me. She said, "The whole ordeal was the most amazing experience of God providing for our every need. I wouldn't change it for anything. It was a privilege." Verse 2, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." Well, we're going to be considering this, and we'll be considering it for a few weeks as well. I mean, this is a big proposition, I realize, and don't worry, I think we've got 5 weeks in chapter 1, so we're going to go quite slowly to try to really absorb what's going on in this book. Well, let's just sort of give a few little details. I put the next heading there, the background. Who exactly was James? It's good to know who we're listening to, isn't it? And what's going on. So let me give you a little bit more about what we do know about James. Well, we know from other Gospels, other places in the New Testament, that James was one of the few younger brothers that Jesus had. And so he too, like Jesus, had Mary and Joseph as parents. I mean, what a family to grow up in. Can you imagine having Jesus as your older brother? I mean, he's sort of the most impossibly perfect role model to have as a big brother. You can imagine the playground, a sort of made-up situation where perhaps James was sort of getting into a bit of a fight with one of the other kids. You know, oh, James, why can't you be like your older brother? You can imagine the situation, can't you? We don't know exactly when the letter was written, but it could well have been one of the first New Testament letters written, perhaps as early, some speculators, 40 AD. What we know for sure is that by the time of writing, James held his brother Jesus in the highest regard. I mean, just look at the opening verse again. Verse 1, look how he describes him and his brother. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. He considers God and Jesus Christ sort of synonymously with equality, and he describes his brother as both Lord, that means his master, and Christ, his king. It's quite a way to describe your older brother. Verse 1 continues, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. Now, in the book of Acts, we read that James was in the position of leadership in the churches in Jerusalem, and he would have had an influence on lots of the Jewish churches that were spread out in the dispersion beyond the borders of Israel. And these people were clearly going through trials, some suffering, perhaps because they were Christians, but quite low level, because this letter was very early. I mean, it would have been before real sort of hardcore persecutors like Nero came to power. What we're looking at here is quite low-level Christian persecution, probably, but lots of trials in life. So to the first point, and I'll say a little bit more about what trials are in a moment. Now, James wants us, as readers, on the first point there, to be aiming for all joy in every situation. All joy in every situation. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. I think over the years, as I sort of pondered this, a few things really stand out from this statement. The first is that phrase, count it. It's really important to understand what that means. I mean, counting it is something that we actively do to ourselves. It's like crediting what's going on to ourselves. It means making a right judgment of what's going on before us, the trial, and somehow crediting the trial to us as joy. The exact phrase is all joy. The emphasis, therefore, is on the intensity rather than the exclusivity. So James is not saying that joy will be the only response or could be the only response for the Christian or should be the only response. He's not saying that at all. But he's saying that a trial is an occasion for an intense type of joy. What we're dealing with here is primarily a matter of the will, not the emotions. It's something that comes from the heart, not the gut, in biblical terms. One commentator puts it like this: it's the conscious, determined commitment of every faithful believer. And that's going to be necessary, isn't it, on that scale of sort of 0.1 to 100 in terms of the intensity of the trial. It's going to depend, as the trial becomes more intense, more severe, more shocking, more emotionally consuming, we're going to have to exercise more conscious, determined commitment to make sense of it, to count it all joy. So that raises the question, I think, at least it did in my mind as I was preparing, so it's the question I'm answering now. That raises the question in my mind of what exactly are we talking about in terms of trials? I've already said a little bit. Trials of various kinds. James throws the net wide. Hardships like sickness, bereavement, pain, the sort of stuff that affects everybody in the world at different times. Some more severely than others, depending on life situations, history, that sort of thing. It's also going to include, as I've said, persecution for being a Christian, but that's not particularly the focus of James. And in fact, much of the rest of the letter, he's not dealing with the results of persecution. He's dealing with the results of just messed up relationships and worlds. So I think that's much more the focus through the letter. So on the one hand, it's quite minor stuff. You want to go to work one day, you dash downstairs, you grab your bicycle, it's got a flat tire, and you think, oh, what a pain in the neck. Opportunity. Okay, I think that's a 0.1, maybe 0.2, depending on how important the meeting is that you're going to be late for. Maybe it's a 1 or a 2, but it's not very high up it. But that is an opportunity to count it all joy. Here is an opportunity to say, the Lord has got this. to something a little bit more serious. I mean, run with this for a moment. This isn't a prophecy, but imagine you go back to your desk after work and there's an envelope, and the envelope says you're fired in nice sort of, corporate terms. Now, what goes through your head at that point? As I said this yesterday at Fleet Street, there were some people looking genuinely nervous as I talked about this sort of made-up scenario, and I think people start to sort of, their minds race, don't they? Oh, he's talked about being fired. Well, what if I am fired? And things like that. Anyway, just sort of run through the made-up scenario for a moment. I mean, a lot of things are going to go through your head, aren't they, as you read an unexpected letter that contains a serious setback. I think it's fair to say that all of us would have a lot of emotions that we'd suddenly be gripped by. Shock. Sadness. You like your job, let's say. Worry about money might kick in. Shame. Reputation. I mean, we care about what other people think. We don't want to have to deal with that as well as everything else. All of those things come flying in with different degrees. And James is not suggesting that other emotions won't be affecting us at the same time as all of this. But here's the key. As a Christian, they won't take hold in the end. One dominant reality can start to override all others. Joy. All joy, to be precise, this very intense type of reaction. And I think that raises the question, how on earth is that possible? Especially as we move up the scale, up to 100. How on earth is that possible? Well, look at verse 3. James goes on to explain. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. So this is one of the things that we're going to have in our mind as we are counting the trial joy. We're going to have to remember that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. So that's helpful, isn't it? That means, of course, it's not because I enjoy the trial, but because I enjoy and I love what the trial produces. Steadfastness, that's a sort of a growing or maturing conviction that my faith is right, that I have put my confidence in the right place in the moment of trial. See, trials cause my faith to develop, to strengthen, to become steadfast. Anyone can walk around and say, oh yeah, I'm a Christian. That's not hard. But if it's just words on our lips, it doesn't have much backbone. Trials give us backbone. This steady, growing, maturing conviction, stronger, resilient faith, immovable, you might say, stable. It's the idea, isn't it? As faith is strengthened in this way, it's a popular illustration, but it makes sense of what's going on. You go to the gym, and one of the purposes that some people might have in the gym is to grow or build muscles. And as I understand it, the way that muscle develops is through first being broken down so that it grows back stronger. Trials make our faith grow. In the end, they grow in steadfastness, verse 3. And then look at verse 4. Let steadfastness have its full effect. That is, as we patiently and joyfully endure the trials, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. That'd be wonderful, wouldn't it? Especially as the intensity of the trial increases, to just know through a really severe emotional setback that you lack nothing. That's wonderful. The end of the summer, we saw across the news, a lot of forest fires, didn't we? They were all over the US and Canada and other places in the world. And certainly as far as trees are concerned, a lot of those fires look like game over. But I was interested to read somewhere along the line that experts say that small, frequent fires, I think they call them cool fires, actually are necessary for good tree growth. They sort of clean the forest floor, all the dead leaves and branches get sort of swept away by the fire. They don't actually destroy the trees, but they leave behind ash, which is perfect for seeds to grow. And so surprisingly, low-intensity fires are necessary for healthy, growing trees. You can see the point. What I love about James is he's so very realistic. he knows, of course, that our experience this side of heaven is going to be a far cry from feeling like we lack nothing. Trial intensity 90. That's not going to be the first thing that comes flying into your head. Even if you're very mature, I'd like to say. You're not going to immediately say, I lack nothing. And so James goes on to explain exactly what we need to do when we feel like we do lack. Because the reality is, if we're Christians, we don't lack. When we feel like we do, what do? Well, verse 5, wisdom, says James. You need wisdom. Okay, you need wisdom to keep going, and that's the second point. Verse 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. So wisdom from above will enable us to face the trials of life with joy. I mean, isn't it great that all we have to do is ask? Just have to ask the Lord God. Now, James goes on to explain that there is a right way and a wrong way to ask for this wisdom. Verse 6, but let him ask in faith, with no doubting. There needs to be a sincerity going on here. Let him ask in faith with no doubting. Now, it can be a little bit strange on the first reading. It almost looks like James is saying that if you display even a hint of doubt in your prayers, then God will not answer you. But that's not the case. Even the most mature believer with a severe trial is going to have doubts. What is in view, I believe, is the overall state of mind of the believer. He doesn't expect us to be doubt-free. He wants us to be the sort of people who can move forward in God's world, confident in the end that we do have a sovereign master and Lord over everything. And so sometimes when the trial is severe, we will need other people to remind us of that. This is a letter written to a group of churches. Within churches, there will be the need for Christians to remind each other how to respond during times of trial. But in the end, will we be those who, like my Uncle John, trust the Lord? It was wonderful to see how he could do that. Verse 6, for the one who doubts is like the wave of a sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. You see, to let doubts take the upper hand is to lose control. That's going to be a very real sort of situation sometimes, isn't it? Where we can just start to go down a little bit of a path where we feel a little bit stressed, anxious, path that's quite dark. And we sort of know some truth that might help, but it becomes harder to focus on. I remember as a teenager hiring a windsurfer once. It was down on the south coast of England somewhere, I think in Devon, and there was a very strong offshore wind. This is me sort of setting up lots of excuses for why I needed to be rescued. But I did indeed need to be rescued. I had a fantastic half hour. But the offshore wind, that means you're sort of blown further and further out, unless you're quite sort of skilled or at least moderately good, which I wasn't. You get stuck quite deep out to sea, and I was completely exhausted. I was getting blown around. I actually started to feel really seasick because the waves were sort of going up and down like this, and I kept on trying to pull up the sail and just fell off and that sort of thing. Anyway, I had no choice in the end but just lie on the board and wait for the rescue boat. It was quite embarrassing getting towed back. In the same way, if we let doubts take the upper hand, it will be as though someone else has control over us. If we let doubts take the upper hand, it will be as though someone else has control over us. That is to be double-minded. Well, that's a horrible sort of feeling and reality to have. Verse 7, for that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He's a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. That's quite a dangerous situation to be in. The double-minded man is a large feature within the book of James. Literally a man with two souls. This is a man who, like a wave of the sea, tossed and driven, a person without consistency. This sort of person doesn't move forward in God's world through thick and thin. Instead, he's unstable, divided thinking. 1 foot here, 1 foot there. and emotional, inconsistent reactions that never really stabilize. And so the implicit challenge in all of this is to be people who are increasingly wholehearted, committed to seeing God's ways in this world, confident that whatever happens, God has got me. So not allowing uncertainty or trials to knock us off perch, but pulling ourselves together. That's what that's what the imperative is saying. Count it all joy. Pull yourself together. Be prepared to pull others together who are losing it because of what they're going through. That's the single-minded perspective. He is our Lord and Master. I may not like what I'm going through. I may call out in anguish sometimes to the Lord, why are you putting me through this? But at those times, even at those times, I can trust him, even if it doesn't make sense to me. The single-minded man will exhibit an underlying consistency of purpose in his life. He's going to be a long way from perfect, but will be growing in his Christian maturity. Sometimes he doubts that God will listen, but he asks in faith anyway, and God gives it to him. And so he's able to face even the trials of life with the right perspective. And it's wonderful because the trials, as we see them with the right perspective, daily tests, all of us will be going through a plethora of trials at any particular time. I guess the simple fact that we're here and listening to a talk means the sort of trials that we're sort of dealing with today are probably mostly quite small. I don't know your personal situations. But those small things, the rubs of life, those are the things that actually allow us to bodybuild our faith. The rubs of life is a phrase that I nicked from Amy Carmichael. Let me close with a quote from her. She was a Christian missionary in India. She was amazing. She opened an orphanage, founded a mission, did some incredible work. She said this: "The best training is to learn to accept everything as it comes, as from him whom our soul loves. The tests are always unexpected things, not great things that can be written up, but the common little rubs of life, silly little nothings, things you are ashamed of minding, yet they can knock over a strong man and lay him very low." The trials of life, opportunities to count pure joy to ourselves, because in the end we know, whatever we're going through, that God has got this. Well, look, we're out of time, and that gives us a few things to think about in our first installment of James. You'll see a couple of questions there at the bottom, but why don't I hand back now? Tom, you're going to close for us. Actually, no, I've got the... yes, you've got a microphone. Good. Excellent. Hand back to you.